Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. We are so pleased that you are tuning in and connecting with us here today at the Grace Farms Foundation for this very important conversation that we're going to have today about domestic violence and how we can all better prepare in the future to make sure that everyone is safe at home, even and especially during times of crisis. We're going to explore this topic with the help of three expert panelists who will be discussing what we can learn from the global health crisis and the impact it's had and continues to have on the systems that we have in place to help keep victims and survivors safe from their offenders. We would be remiss if we didn't also take some time today, even though we have a limited window today, to reflect on the current crisis unfolding in our communities that's shedding new light on the inequities in our criminal justice system and what that means for those working in the field and on the front lines to prevent domestic violence. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alina Reynolds, and I joined the team here at Grace Farms Foundation just a few short months ago as the general counsel and also as a senior advisor to the Justice Initiative here. The Justice Initiative is just one of 5 initiatives that we have at Grace Farms Foundation. We also have a nature initiative, a community initiative, an arts initiative, and a faith initiative. And under the leadership of Sharon Prince, our CEO, and also under the direction of the head of the Justice Initiative, Rod Katabi, and really through the work of all of us here at the Grace Farms Foundation, the whole team, who work very hard and are here behind the scenes for our first webinar that we're hosting. And without those folks, our entire team, these type of events would not be possible. So I do want to thank them for putting this together, especially difficult when you're dealing with someone who's technically challenged like myself. So thank you for making us look good and making this go smoothly. Through the Justice Initiative and the team here, it's our mission to work on several problems, including gender-based violence and domestic violence. And we look at this problem and all the issues that we address through the foundation through an interdisciplinary approach. And we apply that lens in everything we do. Those of you who are out there who have been able to join us on site at this beautiful facility, you know that we regularly convene top experts in the field across all sectors so that we can learn from and listen to, share ideas and different perspectives and create new outcomes when it comes to ending gender-based violence or human trafficking or wildlife trafficking. These are just some of the focuses of the Justice Initiative. Today, we gather virtually because of the circumstances we're living through right now. And however awkward or however difficult this medium may be, we must continue our work. And so we want to use this medium to listen to and learn from the experts and to work together with our partners so that we know that we can continue the work on the ground to support victims and survivors of domestic violence, to hear their voices, and to finding ways to prevent domestic violence, again, especially during this time of crisis. We are extremely privileged to have 3 experts to lead our discussion today. We have Karen Jarmo from CCADV, Margaret Groban, which is the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and she's the CEO there. Margaret Groban, who is the National Violence Against Women Act and Domestic Violence Coordinator for the Department of Justice, and Calliope Minjiru from UN Women, who's the Chief of Section there. All 3 of these experts work here in Connecticut, work nationally and internationally on a global scale to help victims and survivors of gender-based violence and domestic violence. And so without further ado, I am going to have each one of the panelists introduce themselves. I should let you know at the outset, we're going to kick off the discussion. We'll go through the discussion, and then at the end, we have saved some time in an effort to make this as much of a conversation as possible, even through the screen. We have saved some time, about 10 or 15 minutes, for questions from you, the audience members. And you will be able to ask those questions through the Q&A function on your screen. Since we have such a limited time, I am going to kick it first to Karen and just ask her and then Margaret and then Calliope to give us a little bit of their background, their experience, and their area of expertise before we begin with the questions. So Karen.
Oh, good morning, or good afternoon, I should say at this point. It feels like morning still. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. My name is Karen Jarmo. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. For those who are watching who are not aware, there's a domestic violence coalition in every state in our nation, and I have the wonderful opportunity to lead CCADV. And what that means is that we work very collectively with Connecticut's 18 domestic violence organizations. They're the really incredible, remarkable advocates that are doing this important work on the ground, assisting nearly 40,000 survivors every year around safety. For my own personal self, I, in my younger years, oversaw a community-based domestic violence organization. I spent some time as a state lawmaker in Connecticut, and for the past 9 years, I've been at CCADV as the Chief Executive Officer.
Great, thank you, Karen. Then we're going to ask Margaret to introduce herself.
Alina, thank you so much, as Karen said, not only for hosting this, but for including me in this conversation. I'm a longtime federal prosecutor. As the National Domestic Violence Coordinator for the Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys, which is the umbrella organization for all 93 U.S. Attorneys' offices around the country, my job is to provide technical support, training, guidance, any kind of assistance to help those offices implement the federal domestic violence laws. And it was in that position that I first met Alina, who was the wonderful Violence Against Women Act point of contact for the District of Connecticut. And even though the vast majority of domestic violence cases are going to be prosecuted on the state, local, and tribal level, now more than ever, it's important, I think, to include the federal government in the discussion to see if we can offer any kind of value to especially vulnerable domestic violence victims. So I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Calliope, could you give us a brief introduction and some of your background?
Yes, hello Alina and colleagues, and thank you very much for including UN Women in this conversation. We're very honored to be among these distinguished experts like yourself, Alina, and the others. I'm Calliope Migiru. I'm the chief of the Ending Violence Against Women section at UN Women in headquarters, which is the unique global UN entity within the United Nations system, servicing governments to achieve gender equality around the world in line with their international obligations and international human rights standards. Ending violence against women and girls, it's a key area of UN Women's work, and we try to help governments to have a holistic approach in achieving their goals in ending violence against women and girls through legal and policy reforms, addressing root causes of violence against women, having service provision on the ground, and facilitated with data collection, use, and analysis. I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm very close to the mandate and the work that you have been doing. I used to be a practicing lawyer in Athens, and also I served as an international human rights lawyer as well, both for the United Nations and international and national civil society organizations in the area of human rights, women's rights, and refugee protection. And thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to be here with you today.
Great, thank you so much. And as I said, we are very privileged to have all three of you join us today, and we do appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. One of the things we've all been reading about since this global pandemic hit the world, really, is, there have been a lot of articles about how this is affecting women, children, families that have to live with offenders or that are victims or survivors of domestic violence. And what that means for them is when you have these stay-at-home orders that say you have to stay at home, what does it mean when these individuals just don't feel safe at home? And so we've read a lot about this, and there's been a lot of reporting, but we wanted to start really with, now that we're 3-4 months into this, there has been some data. And I know, Karen, that you and CCADV have been trying to collect that data. And I thought we'd start there to see what, if you could describe, how what data you're collecting and what you're seeing so far during this crisis.
Sure, thank you. So this has been just a remarkable time for all of us and for various systems. And, early on in the start of this pandemic, around early March, it was really important for the domestic violence advocacy community, especially in Connecticut, to activate its emergency response plans, which really prioritize the safety of survivors as well as the safety of advocates. So what does that mean? First and foremost, at the beginning of March, the domestic violence shelters of the 18 so-called sites in Connecticut were at 130% capacity, which is a number they function at all the time. But in a period of social distancing, we needed to quickly decompress the numbers in shelters so that families and individuals weren't sharing rooms or extra spaces. We're currently at 118% capacity, but when I say that, I think what's helpful for people to know is that what that means is that individuals are in hotels. So we're hoteling families and individuals and also keeping shelters at just short of 100% capacity. So it meant that the advocacy needed to change. Advocates became remote advocates. A lot of emphasis on technology, actively reaching out. We're finding that advocates in communities and community-based domestic violence organizations are increasing by 23% their outgoing and incoming activity in terms of survivors whom they're working with. The domestic violence hotline, CT Safe Connect, is viewing a remarkable increase, about 30% heightened activity over what we were viewing the months previous to that. In particular, which I think is important to note, is that 62% of those individuals reaching out to CT Safe Connect have never reached out before. So we're finding that perhaps individuals who are at home with their abusive partner, who are not feeling safe, are figuring out ways to reach out for help. And the benefit of Safe Connect is that it's text platform, live chat, or email, so that it doesn't have to be a phone call. Of concern is we're seeing a decrease in calls to law enforcement. So there's been a 4% decrease across the state of Connecticut in the number of calls that law enforcement is receiving around family violence. But added to that, we know that in Connecticut, there's something that we called the lethality assessment program. That's a risk assessment screen for homicide that law enforcement does with victims at the scene of an incident. And so we're actually seeing a 29% increase in the number of times that law enforcement, even though they're being called to the scene fewer times, they're increasing the amount of times they're going to reach out to an advocate where that screen is concerning to them. There's been a drop in restraining order applications in the state of Connecticut. Governor Lamont, through executive order, issued the opportunity. We advocated strongly for this, for an online restraining order application process in the civil court. And even though CT Safe Connect, for example, has assisted with more than 100 applications with advocates also in communities who are assisting with applications, because we know that CT Safe Connect always connects the survivor to their local community and an advocate in their community. There's been a 38% drop in the number of restraining order applications during this pandemic. And so on a silver lining note, what I would end with is HUD funds a project called Domestic Violence Rapid Rehousing that just started here in Connecticut. It's brand new. We started in July. During the pandemic alone, because HUD and many systems adjusted their regulations and guidelines, we've been able to safely house 54 families since March. And that has really been remarkable in terms of how we decompress shelters, how we keep families safe, and how systems can be mindful that we can function in different ways that are more flexible and responsive to the needs of survivors, and everything will be okay. So I will end with that, and I'm happy to weigh in on any of those points. And I just thank you for the conversation.
Thanks, Karen. I'm gonna ask Calliope then. On an international scale, has the UN or through your agency or UN Women been able to collect and perhaps reflect on some of the data and how this health crisis is affecting victims and survivors in countries where they're more vulnerable or where the systems aren't even in place? It sounds like in Connecticut, they were able to shift very quickly and be nimble in how they made sure they met victims where they are during this time. How, what are you seeing in these countries where that may not be as easily done?
Thank you, Alina, and thank you, Karen, because I have to say that some of the findings that you have just shared at the local level, it's also some of the findings that we have had at global level and across different regions and countries. But what I would like to emphasize and framing the issue is about the cases and the increase of reporting that we currently see after the outbreak of COVID-19. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not COVID that has created this spike of violence against women and girls. Just to give you a little bit of some alarming rates already before the outbreak of COVID-19, globally, 1 in 3 women at some point in their lifetimes, they experienced sexual and physical violence. 1 in 3 women. In some countries, that gets up to 70%. And we know from global figures that 6 out of 10 women have been intentionally killed by their intimate partner or spouse. So I'm saying that because also that reveals that less than 40% of these women who have experienced violence, they seek out for help from the official service providers. And from this 40%, less than 10% they seek support from the police. I'm saying that we already had very alarming rates globally. So what we experience right now from the rapid data collection we do is, first of all, that this, we see in some regions, we see an increase of reporting and calls to helplines, to police, up to 30% in some cases. And we don't know if these are new cases, old cases, how complex they are, how many times they call, and something that it merits some more analysis and thinking on behalf of all of us being involved. The second finding that we found is that in some regions and some countries, we see exactly the opposite phenomenon. We see a decrease of calls. And we know what we hear from our partners globally, that in some countries, they don't even know if these services for survivors are still available, because in many countries, these services for survivors, they haven't been considered as essential ones. So the survivors are not reaching out to seek for help, which is extremely worrisome for us, that we have survivors that they are trapped with their abusers and they cannot reach out because they don't know where and how to do that. The third point is that we have seen as very well, you highlighted, Alina, that the service providers in many countries, they try to adapt quickly to the new normality and to the circumstances that COVID-19 has created. But just remember that in many countries, we have a serious gender digital divide. And also for us and for the United Nations, reaching out to remote populations and women and girls, that they have been systematically dropped out of policies and responses of systems and governments. It's very, very challenging because they don't have access to technology or mobile phones. And therefore, us, it has been a very serious challenge, because reaching out through our community networks has been really challenging because of the social distancing and the policies that COVID-19 has imposed in order to curb the pandemic. And also we have seen that a lot of service providers, they really had to reshift the focus from services and resources, from services to survivors, to health services to address the COVID-19. And we have seen in some places where women's rights organizations, they are the main service providers for survivors because of the chronic financial constraints that they have been struggling with all these years. They had some difficulty to shift in quickly to what they needed to do to provide services to survivors and to address the spike of violence against women and girls. And some of them, unfortunately, they had to close even because they didn't have the capacity to remain open. These are some key findings from some of the data, but I have to say, I don't know what your experience is here in the United States. For us, in most countries, we do not encourage our offices to collect data for survivors unless it's absolutely necessary, because we know the demographics and the surveys that we've had before in place. We know about the alarming rates of violence against women. So we knew, we were expecting that. And we try to do that in an ethical and safe way for survivors, because of primary importance right now, it's not to put the safety of survivors at risk, especially when they are trapped with their own abusers. And that makes it extremely difficult for them to go out and seek for support and report them the crime that it's happening. I will stop here, and I hope I have the opportunity in the second set of questions to elaborate a little bit about the current challenges and what we can do. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that overview. And it is sobering, and I know incredibly challenging in the areas that UN is working with on this. It's a difficult problem anywhere, and if you're also operating in countries whose systems are already under a lot of stress, I'm sure it's even more difficult. But we do want to try to learn from this and hear from you all and what you're hearing in the field, and then learn from this so we can better prepare, like I said, in the future. And so I'm going to shift a little bit now to what we can learn from, or what issues we're seeing when there's already there has been a call to the police, there has been a prosecution that's begun, there's been an investigation or prosecution cases pending. And I'm going to ask Margaret to comment and discuss sort of what we're seeing happen to cases in the system, and how agents and prosecutors had to shift or learn to adapt to make sure that victim who was courageous enough to call the police and get help, to make sure that their voice is being heard through the criminal justice system, while this COVID-19 crisis is affecting the court system. So if you could talk a little bit about that and what you've seen and what we can learn from that.
Sure. I mean, just to piggyback on what both Karen and Kalippi are discussing, this is a very challenging time, and it's kind of a perfect storm of events that domestic violence victims are isolated either with their abuser, which is challenging, or isolated away from their abuser, which also can be challenging because they don't know what the abuser is up to. So either way, it's very difficult for victims. And the perceived lack of access to law enforcement and courts is something that we are fighting every day. It doesn't matter that the courts are slightly open, certainly things are reduced, but what's important is that law enforcement and NGOs are open for business, but people perceive that if they call the police, they won't respond. So they're scared to call the police. So we're trying to fight that perception that law enforcement is not available. But certainly there are challenges with law enforcement. Obviously, in any kind of these cases, it's so important for law enforcement and U.S. attorneys' offices to establish a relationship with the victim and establish trust so that the case can move forward in a successful way. But if you cannot meet with the victim personally, it's much more difficult to establish that trust. So law enforcement, the goalposts are constantly shifting, but at least for the federal law enforcement agencies, they are allowed to respond if there is a threat to life. And certainly in domestic violence cases, there would be a threat to life. but they respond with PPE. If they have to meet them personally, they have to stay distant. All of that impedes the ability to establish a relationship with the victim to go forward. But we all, as you said, Alina, the operative word is nimble. We all have to be nimble in how we respond to these situations. And, you know, we've already heard of abusers taking advantage of COVID, making a victim sleep in the car because they perceive that they're going to get COVID, or they use it as an excuse to impose restrictions on victims. Another huge problem has been jails, which are releasing people because they're concerned and they're getting compassionate release motions to release people from jail. We've had abusers who, the second they're released from jail, go back home and reoffend. So we're just trying to be as creative as we can, but as everyone has said so far, the calls are either going up, which is concerning, or the calls are going down, which is concerning, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. But the one thing that has been a constant is that the request for protection orders has gone down dramatically. And we don't think it's because the abusive behavior isn't happening. We just think, and there is reduced access to courts. Although the advocates are being nimble and adjusting online, the courts are being a little less nimble in making themselves available in these situations. So I hope that we can continue to react to these things. A problem is our grand juries even sitting to indict cases. That's been a problem, but I think as states move into different phases, we hope that things will open up. But the one message I do want to relay is that law enforcement is responding, and so it is really important that these multidisciplinary teams or high-risk response teams or coordinated community responses, whatever it's called in your jurisdiction, that the collaboration is more critical now than ever to make sure that victims' needs are being addressed and that safety plans are being enacted.
Right, that's great. And that's why it's great to have all three of your perspectives here today as well, to really emphasize the need. Particularly, we've always known in this area that we all, prosecutors, law enforcement, service providers, victim advocates, local organizations, international organizations have to work together and not silo ourselves if we're going to be successful in the ultimate goal, which is really preventing domestic violence. We can react to the cases we have, but the goal is to educate and prevent. And so having seen and having heard from you what you're hearing from the field, what you're seeing in anecdotally and also through data collection, I want to kind of shift the conversation a little bit. And so we've seen what some of the weaknesses are. What can we do in the community? What can organizations do? What can law enforcement do to better prepare to protect victims in the future, if there's another, as this health crisis continues, because it's continuing, and also now, you know, there's going to be this economic downturn that's going to be sustained, and that also affects the domestic violence victims and survivors. And so I'm going to ask Calliope, what is the UN preparing to do to strengthen its response to make sure you know, having seen what can happen as far as calls going down, less protective orders, people not knowing that they can call and reach out to your field organizations. What can we do to prepare ourselves as we go through this crisis and in the future for different crises?
Thank you very much, Alina. And we have already touched upon some of these issues in the first set of the questions and the first part of the discussion. However, I would like to start with something you said, which I find very, very important, and it's key in the work of UN Women. Having services in place to address the immense needs of survivors is very important, and it's critical, of course, because we need to address these health and psychological needs that they have. But at the same time, if we really want to eliminate violence against women and girls, domestic violence and other forms of violence one day, we really need also to focus our efforts on addressing the root causes, the power and control, the gender imbalances in the relationships through prevention strategies. And we know increasingly that we have more evidence that we have some strategies in place that they can decrease violence against women and girls, not even in a decade, but in the programmatic cycle of the intervention through certain school interventions, for example, community mobilization adapting to the national and local context, couple interventions, etc. But what I would really like to emphasize, I think COVID highlighted very clearly that the way the system works and the way our society works, it's not ideal. And although it's a pandemic and it's a crisis, also it presents some opportunities to us to do things differently and to act quickly through innovative solutions and partnerships. I think if we really want to prevent the root causes, we need to look into our own organizations, first of all, and to really bring some institutional change, some deep change in the way the police works, for example, the way service providers work. How do we make sure that we have gender equality mechanism within our own organizations that we are called to support survivors when they need it? And also, I think it's really important to really support women's rights organizations to do the work they do to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls. For us, for UN Women, it's very important. What we have seen in many countries is that very often violence against women is really treated in isolation, and it's not integrated in a broader framework of how the governments need to react and to have a truly multi-sectoral approach to violence. For us, in many countries, usually violence against women and girls is dealt within the Ministry of Women or the Ministry of Gender, depending on how they call it. And that really makes coordination between the different sectors, the financial sector, justice sector, health sector, more difficult to address violence in a systematic and coordinated way. So you can imagine now under COVID, this coordination mechanism, they have collapsed completely. So for us, we advocate to see violence against women and girls to be integrated from a policy perspective and from a programmatic perspective into the broader COVID-19 national and recovery plans. Otherwise, this area of work will drop off the national priorities, and we won't have any resources, adequate resources being allocated to respond to violence. Also, what we do, COVID had revealed the really big challenges that service provision systems have been facing around the world. And it's really essential right now for UN Women to support and strengthen the capacity of service providers around the world on how to adapt quickly through innovative solutions. And for us, because of the reasons I explained before, it's not only through technology platforms, but also how do we engage with community given the different phases of COVID to make sure that we reach out to survivors, to communities, and less privileged women's groups in the communities. And lastly, I think 2 more points. It's very critical for us supporting the civil society organizations, women's rights organizations, that they have been doing this work for many, many years. And they position violence against women and girls as a critical concern and policy agenda for so many governments around the world. And what we see in many parts of this world is that many of them will stop existing if we don't support them adequately. And I think, as I said before, prevention is very important. Even during COVID-19, how can we really engage men as well to share more in a more gender equitable way the work they do at home, for example? How can we shift the gender roles and the perceptions that they exist in our minds? And how can we approach them to make sure that they can, because of all this stress and financial constraints that everybody faces right now, to make sure that any kind of conflicts is resolved in a respectful and peaceful way. Thank you.
And that's, I mean, that's a big part of it is now, you know, economies and resources are going to be even more stressed. Getting resources is a big part of the problem, right, to provide the services. And so I want to ask Karen just to discuss that briefly as far as Connecticut. You know, you mentioned the HUD program and the success you've had there, but that shelters, even during normal times, so to speak, are always at capacity or above capacity. So what can be done here at the local level to make sure that we don't lose those resources, in fact, that we get the resources we need to keep working on solving this issue?
Sure, that's a really important point. We know that through the statewide domestic violence Safe Connect hub, we are hearing more and more from survivors about their concerns around the violence and the power and the control and the manipulation, of course. And then due to the COVID epidemic, we have this added layer of worries around job loss and basic human needs and housing. And it adds a heightened level of trauma and anxiety. And so advocates, as you can imagine, are actively working in communities to connect survivors to resources. There have been, thankfully, new resources, whether that's through HUD or FEMA, DEMAS, and mental health organizations. There are new resources available, knowing that these supports are going to be necessary. From the advocacy standpoint, at the end of the day, we know that we are one piece of the puzzle in terms of how to help keep victims safe. And more than ever, it's been important for advocates to work very collaboratively and collectively with systems and systems partners throughout this pandemic. I want to pivot just very slightly to make note of what Margaret was referencing earlier in terms of the criminal justice response to this issue, to give an example of systems, right? So we know that during the pandemic, law enforcement are not holding offenders as they would. So these offenders, even when they're arrested, are being given a promise to appear. And that might not be the next day in court because courts aren't open as they would. Connecticut's gone from 19 judicial court sites down to 6. They're starting to reopen. But we know that cases, therefore, are being continued for months down the road. So what does that mean in terms of offender accountability? And offender programs have been temporarily suspended. So the need for advocates and prosecutors and family relations officers and the judicial branch to be working, and they have been very collaboratively around safety and risk and communication. I think enhanced communication during this pandemic has been critical. Working together on adjusted policies which highlight victim safety. So I would say that as we move forward, because we know that there's going to be a continued need for this, it's critical that systems prioritize victim safety, offender accountability, and responses that really are proactive as opposed to reactive.
Right. I'm going to shift to another spike that we saw in the numbers, and you know, the numbers around COVID, the numbers that you've discussed, Karen and Calliope. Another number that was alarming to me, and just reading about it, is the number of gun sales. That number went up, and in a large part during and right before the shutdown orders and the stay-at-home orders, and apparently it continues to go up. And so I'm going to ask Margaret to talk a little bit about, you know, the work that the department has done in the past with regard to the VAWA statutes and the gun statutes in particular, and Project Safe Neighborhoods, and the importance of that work in keeping guns out of the hands of DV offenders. So if you could talk a little bit about that, Margaret, I'd appreciate
Sure,
it.
Alina. I mean, Alina just referenced Project Safe Neighborhoods. It's called PSN, is one of the Department of Justice's initiatives to keep our neighborhoods safe. But our mantra has been, those of us who work on the DV side of the house, that you can't have safe neighborhoods without safe homes. So a lot of U.S. attorneys' offices have included domestic violence as part of the initiative. I know District of Connecticut did, to make sure that home safety, as Karen said, our watchwords are the same. Victim safety and offender accountability is what we're geared towards. And so part of our initiative involves enforcement of two specific federal gun laws. One which prohibits persons subject to qualifying protection orders from having guns, and one which prohibits persons who have been convicted of qualifying misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence from having guns. So the importance is that because studies show that there's increased danger of lethality if a firearm is in the home. So now comes COVID, and Alina is right. The numbers are staggering in terms of gun purchases. And I looked just today to confirm that the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, which is called NICS, which is where you go, which does the Brady background check. So if someone goes to buy a firearm from a federal firearm licensee, they have to have a background check done. So this doesn't even include those sales that don't involve federal licensees. So if you get a gun from a swap guide or from someone on the corner, these are not even included. But they keep track of the 10 highest days and the 10 highest weeks of gun sales. And they've been keeping track of that since NICS became effective in 1998. And since COVID in March, we have had 5 of the 10 highest days of gun sales and 5 of the highest weeks of gun sales. And just to give you on one specific day, the highest day right now is Friday, March 20th of 2020, where there were 210,000 background checks done for guns. While normally there's a range of maybe 1 to 2 million gun sales a month, in March of this year, 3.7 million gun sales took place. In April, 2.9 million sales. In May, 3 million background checks. So the numbers of gun sales are staggering. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at victim safety, which is to try and utilize these federal gun statutes or state gun statutes if they're available. Again, another reason to collaborate with our state and local partners to see whether or not we can find those offenders. And the problem is they don't walk around with signs on them saying, I am a prohibited person. So that requires coordination with both advocates, NGOs, and law enforcement to find those persons who are prohibited, who may have firearms, so that federal law enforcement can react to those situations, because it's so important to keep guns out of those homes.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. And we'll continue to collaborate, as you said, with state and local government. Here in Connecticut, it's been great because there is a very good collaboration and good communication between our state prosecutors, our local PDs, who are the ones that are gonna respond to just a regular call. But they, there's been a lot of training through all of us to make sure that patrol officer who responds to a DV scene does a little more than just take a complaint and look around and get more information. Similar to what we've done with the opioid crisis, like take that as an opportunity to make sure you're looking around and gathering evidence, because it literally saves lives. And the cases we've done here in our district showed that. So we will continue those efforts, I'm sure, at the local, state, and federal level. Given the time and given just all those subjects you've raised, I just wanted to see if we could shift a little bit to, there's the crisis that's caused by the health crisis, the global pandemic, and the economic downturn. And in recent days and weeks, we've seen another community crisis, shedding light, as I said, on some of the inequalities and inequities in the system, in law enforcement and in the criminal justice system. I wanted to see, and maybe start with Karen, just what CCADV is doing as an organization, as a member of the community, as far as reaching out and making sure that all communities, are heard in the area of domestic violence, to make sure that we're reaching all victims. I know internationally that's the big issue, right? On a global scale, when you have governments that don't treat women the same and don't even maybe in some countries have laws on the books. What are we doing here to make sure in a place where we do have laws on the books and we have a criminal justice system that tries at least to protect victims of domestic violence, what can we do in the community to make sure we respond to the current issues that are being raised in the protests and with the issues of inequality? And Karen, you're on mute. Let me see.
Sorry. We are looking inward and outward. We're looking inward at our own system. For example, when CT Safe Connect was launched in November, we recognized the need for bilingual, bicultural advocacy. More than 85% of the advocates on that platform speak Spanish. Others speak multiple other languages such as Urdu, French, Portuguese, Creole, Haitian. We knew that we needed to do better around language, ethnicity, lived experiences. And we're also now assessing within the 18 domestic violence organization sites, what does their advocacy look like? How do we all work collectively to do better? And then we really view the need for CCADV as a social justice organization to be leading on the conversation around racial and gender equity, and to be doing that with our partners. And so we are currently in the planning stages of how we're going to move forward in that direction much more affirmatively, and be listening to the voices of survivors, especially survivors from communities of color, because we know that for many women and women of color who might reach out to law enforcement, we know that they want the violence to stop, but that doesn't mean they want their partner or former partner to lose their life. They should feel comfortable reaching out to various systems, all systems, our system as an advocacy organization, the judicial system, criminal, the law enforcement system. And so I think what the conversation and the actions that have happened over the past few weeks have really raised for all of us is the need for us to do better. And like many others, we're thinking through that right now and going to be taking action.
And I'm just, looks like we're sort of, I don't mean to end with that. I didn't know if Margaret, you wanted to jump in at all, or Calliope, just on making sure that, as prosecutors and law enforcement who worked on these type of cases, we were trained, and we had to change the culture from the very beginning, because in the very beginning, offenders weren't arrested and a lot of these cases weren't taken as seriously as they should have been taken. And we learned to listen a lot. What can we learn from those lessons and just the work and, the arc that we've been through in this arena on the law enforcement side and as prosecutors with what's going on now?
Alina, all I would add is that you're right. I feel like we've traveled so far with law enforcement in terms of their response in domestic violence situations and de-escalation in domestic violence situations. But I think we all need to examine our protocols and practices to make sure that all victims feel that their voices are being heard and that their crimes are being prosecuted and that their offenders are being held accountable. So I hope that that is something that we will redouble our efforts to make sure that that is happening through all the U.S. Attorney offices around the country.
Okay, can I come in very, very quickly? I think both colleagues raised a very important issue. For us, it's very important to have a survivor-centered approach to all the service provision and how we approach case of survivors. Not all survivors, they want the violence to stop, but maybe they don't want the partner to be in prison and to because they don't want to lose the income as well. Apart from the fact that also we have in many communities that they are afraid that these communities have been marginalized for so long that they will bring extra stigma and extra pressure on the communities by reporting the violence that happens to them. And so we need to do a lot of work with the communities, but also a survivor-centered approach and unfolding it realistically of what it means in order to have the right approach to what survivors need. I think it would be very important.
Right, and I think that goes to the point of everyone working together, as you all do in your capacity with the agencies and organizations you work with, and understanding the community and just having empathy. And I think those who work in this area are trained to do that and have experienced having empathy and understanding, the facts from not just the police officer's point of view or the victim's advocate's point of view, but you can walk around those facts from everyone's point of view. And I think the more we can do to listen and learn from the community members as well, I think hopefully we will do better, as Karen and Margaret and Calliope said. Amazingly, we're at the time where we should be taking questions. I could talk forever about these issues. But I did, as I said at the outset, we wanted to make this feel as much as a panel discussion we'd have here on site. And include members of the audience. I'm going to try to, I know some questions have been posted on the Q&A. And I have one from an audience member who says, oftentimes victims won't call out to law enforcement or make reports because they feel that not enough is being done to protect them from retaliation or continued abuse. And so I know that this is part of the struggle, I think, and those who work directly with victims, Karen, your advocates, and all of the panelists. Oftentimes the most dangerous time or the most precarious time for a victim can be when they're considering calling the police or calling for intervention of some sort. So I guess the audience members, what can be done to make victims feel that they will be protected if they reach out for help? Karen, do you want to talk about what
there's a lot of reasons why victims don't choose to reach out to law enforcement. And I know we're running out of time, so I won't go into all of those reasons, but what I would say is that it's really important for victims to feel and survivors that the system is working. And it can be challenging when offenders aren't necessarily held accountable, when cases are not prosecuted. And so also, though, the experience that victims receive at the scene of the incident is really critical as well. And I think that's the relationship building between law enforcement and the advocacy community. I think the lethality assessment program has been helpful around that. But calling for help for law enforcement is one option. And it is certainly not an option that all survivors choose, and that is fine. And so, but when they do choose that option, it's really important for them to have confidence that they will be heard, that they will be helped, and that they will have increased safety.
And I just would want to add on a federal level that that's really critical to us, because a number of the victims that we see have been through the state system and they do not feel it has worked for them. So that when they do come in the federal system, we do have more resources. We have a victim witness coordinator, and we do everything we can to try and ensure their safety. That the saddest thing is when I hear something like that a victim won't call to hold the offender accountable because they're worried about their danger. And although we can't assure someone's safety, I hope that we can develop safety plans that allow victims to move forward if what they're looking for is to hold the offender accountable. Because sometimes when the offender is in jail is the time where a victim can make decisions then about what they want their future to look like.
That's right. And we have another, picking up on the federal response, we have a question from a member of the audience who is asking what kind of domestic violence situations would have federal agents responding, which is a good question, I think, for the public.
Well, I'll answer quickly. There are two kinds. The one are the interstate crimes. I think Alina has prosecuted all kinds of domestic violence cases, but one is if someone crosses a state line, uses a computer with someone who's in another state, and especially the ones we prosecute most often are the gun offenses that I mentioned before. And that's where we can really offer value. And also on the interstate crimes, because it's much easier for the federal government to prosecute crimes that cross a state line because we have nationwide service of process with the FBI and ATF. But those are the cases that can become federal.
Right, and some of the typical ones we're seeing, just to pick up on that, on the federal side, that we were seeing more of because of social media is sort of interstate stalking statutes, because, you know, offenders were offending online and using media, social media, and computers, as Margaret mentioned, to commit their crimes in the cyber world. And so the federal agencies, because we can serve process and make arrests, you know, not just in our jurisdiction, but work with other jurisdictions, it's a lot easier. It's hard for a local PD to try to collect evidence, you know, even in a neighboring state, let alone in California or wherever the evidence may be. So those are the ones we're seeing most of. And I don't know if we still have some time. Let me see, there's a couple more questions. Someone in our audience is asking, you know, what can community members do to support these efforts that you've talked about today? And is asking if there's a list of organizations or what they can do. And I think that's especially important right now, as we mentioned, with all the crises we're all facing, to engage the community and have folks feel like they're also contributing and helping solve the problem. Karen, do you want to talk about that?
Go to our website, which is www.ctcadv.org, and that offers the locations of the 18 offices in Connecticut, domestic violence advocacy organizations, with contact information. I also think that there's an opportunity to support community-based, getting to what Kalopi was speaking about earlier, community-based projects and initiatives that are supporting the healthy development of young men. Because if we're going to really try to get to the root of this problem, how do we think about those programs that are developing young men into healthy human beings and healthy partners? So I would also suggest that for community members to consider.
Great. All right, well, I think we're just at the end here. I just wanted to take a moment again to thank each and every one of you out there in the audience for joining us today. We hope that you learned with us about some of the challenges, but we also hope that, and I like that last question, you know, what can we do? That there's a hopeful response by all of us that, you know, despite the many challenges, that we can each play a role in making sure that our homes, as Margaret said, and our communities are safer. So I want to thank you, the audience. I want to thank especially our panelists. It was great seeing you. I hope that we'll be able to continue this conversation, and hopefully in person here with a live audience, and here at Grace Farms or anywhere else, that will continue the conversation and continue to think about and work on these issues. So with that, thank you all for coming, and be safe. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.